30 years ago, Slowdive released their album Pygmalion. In my eyes, it's a genuine oddity, a curiously beguiling record that marked a complete departure from the band's previous sound. It's spooky and somnambulent, the soundtrack to waking sluggishly from a dream in the middle of the night, uncertain of where you are or what time it is. After the record's release, however, the band would split, and they wouldn't be heard from again for the next 22 years. 30 years on from its release, it's time to look back at that record and approach it afresh, how it was made and why the band spun out of orbit after its release. This is the story of Pygmalion, Slowdive's ghostly, seductive third record. In 1989 in Britain, many young kids were falling under the spell of American alternative and experimental rock bands like Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr.
But I seen too much to try you. It's always weirdness why you dig it much too much to fry you. The weirdness flows.
A new cavalcade of inspired bands started to crop up across the UK and Ireland, who placed particular emphasis on pulverizing guitar riffs, thrashing drums, and, well, noise. One of those bands was Slowdive, a group of 5 teenagers from Reading, formed around the central nucleus of singers Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell. Along with other bands like Chapterhouse and Ride, Slowdive soon became the flag bearers for a scene of loosely associated bands that the UK press quickly labelled shoegaze, so called for the tendency of the guitar-oriented bands to stare down solemnly at their feet when playing live. The band would quickly sign with Creation Records and release 2 full-length albums. 1991's Just for a Day marked itself out with its oceanic, undulating soundscapes that underlined the band's interest in using the voice as an instrument to elicit emotion. Of their approach to recording vocals, singer Rachel Goswell would say, "When we first used to mix records, I would think about the voice being used as another instrument. It's about the atmosphere and the feeling it gives you, rather than pinpointing specific lyrics." The group's knack for dreamy celestial soundscapes, which often placed a premium on atmosphere over hooks, would continue on the band's 1993 record, Soaring. Despite the band's expansive sound, however, shoegaze as a genre was fast becoming the nation's punching bag, with the ringleaders being the UK music press themselves. For much of the music press, the bands at the centre of shoegaze were perceived as being stuck up, haughtily middle class, and lacking the bite of the American alternative rock bands they were inspired by. As such, both of the band's first 2 records were received poorly by journalists at the time, with particular resentment reserved for Soaring. Melody Maker would infamously say of the record, "At its worst, this record is a soulless void, devoid of pain, anger, feeling, or concern. I would rather drown choking in a bath full of porridge than ever listen to it again." Musical tastes were clearly changing fast, and Slowdive risked being left behind, lost in their own daydreams. Though the band were signed to Creation, a kind of indie music incubator, the label's no-nonsense boss, Alan McGee, was increasingly more interested in breaking out of the indie ghetto and finding groups that could reliably bring in album sales. Slowdive were not one of those bands. With McGee applying pressure and the music press souring on them, Slowdive started to buckle. It didn't help that they felt increasingly out of sync with their label mates, bands like Primal Scream and the Boo Radleys, who specialised in their own brand of brash and brazen music, meant for soundtracking boorish nights out. Neil Halstead would recall feeling like outsiders at Creation hangouts. I remember McGee taking us to the Hacienda with Bobby Gillespie. It was about a week after we signed to Creation, and we did a gig in Manchester, and I just sat down and it was a bit like hanging out with your parents, because these guys were like 20 years older than us. That's how it felt. So I don't remember going to a party at Creation. We would always turn up and be slightly aware that a party had been going on. In what felt like a resigned shrug in response to their encroaching circumstances, Slowdive would release the 5 EP at the end of 1993. On that collection of songs, the band would mix their ghostly vocals and sludgy guitars with the dusky electronic breakbeats of trance, a genre of music that Halstead was finding himself mesmerised by. Almost as if in a metaphorical thumbing of their nose at Creation, Slowdive seemed to be doubling down, falling down the sinkhole into further abstraction and atmosphere. With gigs increasingly few and far between, and the band members having to pick up day jobs again to support themselves financially, Creation decided to fund sessions for one last record from the band. Alan McGee supposedly sat Slowdive down and demanded a radio-friendly single from the next album. Pygmalion would not be the record that McGee was after. As the 5 EPs showed, Slowdive were already experimenting with technology, but on Pygmalion the band would show a greater interest in the potential in digital tools for mood and ambience. Halstead in particular was increasingly interested in making music with computers. Of the recording of Pygmalion, Halstead said, "We would play loops and then play over them, and then steal more loops from what we played over them. So there was always an element of humanity, although there was something quite cold about it." You can hear that looping approach on the songs clearly. On the track Trellises, for example, the band would underlay the sound of a ticking clock underneath the repeating warped and pitch-shifted vocals of Halstead. The song has a woozy quality, as if lurching downward or ever further underground. The track feels like an ode to dance music's increasingly undeniable imprint on popular culture, particularly seeming to reference Global Communications' album 7614, a record that has since become a classic in ambient music. That increasing reliance on loops and electronic beats meant there was strain and dislocation in the band, however. Simon Scott, the band's drummer, sensed Halstead's inclination toward the synthetic breakbeats that underlay his new favourite music genre and departed the band before they even began to work on Pygmalion. He explains, "I left because I was told there wouldn't be any drums on the album. I just didn't see any point in sticking around. I wasn't poached by another band, and there were no artistic differences between me and the rest of Slowdive. Neil had been dropping hints that he wanted to make a record that was technology-based. There are no live drums on that record whatsoever." On songs like Miranda, the band would fill the space left by a lack of drums with whirring and whirling noises, with Goswell's siren-like vocals high in the mix, conjuring up images of some nocturnal Lynchian dreamscape. On the track Jay's Heaven, similarly both Halstead and Goswell's voices bob like sea boys toward one another, as if in search. Throughout the record it becomes difficult to discern to actually hear what each vocalist is singing, an intentional strategy by the band to make the listener focus less on what is being said, and focus on the emotion that has been communicated instead. The seeming contradiction at the centre of that lyric was potentially an allusion to the lingering impact of the breakdown of Goswell and Halstead's romantic relationship, which occurred around the time that the band were recording Suvlaki. As Goswell says, when Pygmalion was being recorded, Neil and I were very separate at that point. We were both on a techno trip, experimenting with stupid drugs, him more than me. I had a few trips up to London where I went to some techno clubs. Pygmalion was really, I think, born out of that. It reflected what we were listening to at that time. Halstead would write and come up with ideas alone. As a result, the record often sounds like a Neil Halstead solo record, with more deliberate emphasis on abstraction and space. There are, however, some more direct lyrics where it's possible to glean deeper meaning. On the song Crazy for Love, Halstead repeats just one line over and over. It sounds like a mantra, a desperate incantation by a forsaken lover, lost in the depths of the well of post-breakup loneliness. The eventual feeling of listening to a record like Pygmalion is peaceful but unsettling, like slipping in and out of a fugue state. With the absence of things like regular beats and discernible vocal melodies, it seemed to be a representation of a soul cut adrift or thrown overboard, perhaps reflecting how the band were feeling about their space in the wider music scene. Neil Halstead said it pretty plainly. We all felt we'd had enough of the band. It wasn't a happy time. On the album's final track, he offers up an elegy. Perhaps all of this, the journey Slowdive had embarked upon and the point they had reached, was nothing but a passing dream after all.
It's all is all me.
1 week after Pygmalion was released, Creation dropped Slowdive from their label. The band's spooky, meditative mood piece was not the radio-friendly unit shifter McGee was after. It wasn't exactly unexpected. Halstead said, "I think by that point we were no longer a Creation band. They'd moved on and so had we. I'm just grateful they let us put out Pygmalion." That said, the last laugh seemed to be with Halstead. After all, the record's title was a tongue-in-cheek reference to George Bernard Shaw's classic play, in which a salt-of-the-earth working-class girl is taught how to become more mannered and palatable for a stuck-up English high society. It seemed to be the band making a dig at how McGee and Creation were trying to force the band out of their natural creative urges into a more acceptable template. Pygmalion is not the kind of record that wins you over immediately, but on repeated listens, its sense of disquiet unshackles to reveal deeper pleasures, songs that feel like hymnals or ethereal elegies. Perhaps it's only in more recent years that the record's legacy has been more obviously felt. In the wake of the band's reunion in 2017, spurred on by Gen Z's revival of interest in shoegaze via TikTok, many bands have gone on to say how influential Pygmalion has been for them. You can hear the impact of Pygmalion in scores of post-rock bands, such as Glasgow's Mogwai, or even in the glinting ambience of the American black metal band Death Heaven. Perhaps more than anything, Pygmalion represents a band clinging steadfastly to their own creative imperatives, even in the face of adversity in every direction. It is, at its core, a statement record, a brave leap of faith into uncharted territory, a rocket sent into sonic orbit, into the inky, unknown atmosphere. If you enjoyed this video, perhaps you'll enjoy my dissection of John Martyn's Solid Air, another record that places emphasis on mood and atmosphere, that often obscures a deep tenderness beneath. You can check that video out here. Drop a comment on what this album means to you, and whether you agree on my assessment of Pygmalion. I'd love it if you gave this video a like, and remember to hit subscribe for more videos like this in the future from my channel. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and catch you in the next video.